I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun, The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking. Sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her, but the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up, so I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties. So we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed, and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story, buried for decades. The girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, "I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace." In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. The graveyard shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with the daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened. And tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. When I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me, his eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me, but instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. Stranger on the way home. I was driving home on a quiet, deserted road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. A familiar road I had traveled countless times. I was still about 10 minutes away from home when my car began to slow down. Confused, I pressed the gas pedal, but the car continued to lose speed. Panic set in as I realized the problem I had run out of gas. I suddenly remembered the low fuel warning light had come on, but I had forgotten about it, and in my rush, I had completely missed stopping to refuel. My car stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the chilly night air biting at my skin. Glancing at my phone, I saw the worst: no signal. I wasn't surprised. This road had no reception. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. It was nearly midnight, and there was no point in calling anyone. My friends were likely already asleep. I knew the area well enough to remember a gas station about a mile away. It would take 20 minutes to walk, maybe less, and the weather was fairly mild. So I decided I would make the quick trip. I grabbed an empty gas can I kept in the back of my car for my lawnmower. At least luck was on my side in some small way. There were no streetlights, only dense forests on either side. The road was eerily quiet. Only one or two cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before vanishing into the night. As I walked, my footsteps crunched on the gravel by the roadside. Every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept walking. Then, I heard it. It was the sound of a car engine behind me. I stopped and turned around. A pickup truck was slowly approaching the spot where my car had broken down. My first thought was that they might stop to help, and for a brief moment, I considered asking for a ride. But then I saw them, two men. They got out of the truck, their faces quickly obscured by black masks pulled over their heads. One of them shined a phone flashlight into the window, while the other knocked on the door. They tried to open it, but of course, the doors were locked. I crouched down and moved closer to the edge of the forest, hiding in the shadows. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet, but they were rummaging through my car. Panic rose in me when one of them turned and looked in my direction. Suddenly, he started walking toward me. I froze. The other man got back in the truck, and I heard the engine roar as it sped forward, heading straight for me. I didn't have time to think. I sprinted into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, chasing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. In what felt like an eternity, I ran through the edge of the forest, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. After a few minutes, I saw a large, isolated house ahead of me. I ran behind the house, pressing myself against the rough, cold brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound of pursuit. I crouched there for a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move, cautiously slipping through the backyard toward the old path. I didn't want to knock on the door because it was too late, and I didn't want to cause them any alarm. I walked on high alert, every sound making me shiver. I looked around the area. No truck, no sign of the men. I continued walking toward the gas station. Another car came, and without thinking, I rushed back into the forest, hiding until the sound of the engine faded away. Finally, the gas station appeared in front of me. I felt relief as I filled up the gas canister. When I finally made it back to my car, I shakily poured the gas into the tank. I drove straight home, too scared to look back. As I sat in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the thought of those men, and I realized how lucky I was to have made it home safely. Escape from the terrifying truck. On a Sunday afternoon, Mac and I decided to go hiking in some hills, just an hour's drive from the city. The hill we chose today had a fairly simple trail, not too steep, and when we reached the top, everything felt peaceful, just like any other time we had gone hiking. After a short rest, we started heading down, but just 10 minutes later, Mac began complaining about the rough path. He wanted to take a different trail down. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We hadn't seen another soul since we started our descent. Then we heard the sound of an engine. A rusty, heavy red truck was coming toward us. The man driving rolled down his window and flashed a smile that seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. He offered us a ride. Mac, always trusting, thought the guy seemed nice enough. I wasn't so sure. Mac begged and convinced me to get in, saying it was only a 10-minute drive. I was cautious, but I got in with him. Inside, The truck was shabby but clean. As we settled in, I instinctively started scanning my surroundings. My eyes were drawn to the floor, where I saw a coil of rope behind the driver's seat. Unease began to creep in. 10 minutes passed. We were no closer to the main road, and the woods around us grew denser. I asked the man how much longer it would take. He said we were just taking a different route and that we'd have to stop somewhere to pick up his stuff. We stopped in front of a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. There was an old tree stump out front, with a large axe stuck in it as if he had been chopping wood. I glanced at Mac, but he seemed excited and trusting of the man. The man turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He said,
"Stay here. I'll be right back."
As soon as he was out of sight, panic started to rise within me. I turned to Mac, pleading with him to leave, not to get out, but he didn't see the danger I saw. That's when I turned back to the truck and saw it. Half hidden under the driver's seat was an axe. Dark stains covered the blade stains that could only be blood. I quickly told Mac to look. He froze, his face turning pale as he realized the danger we were in. Without another word, we bolted into the forest, fleeing the imminent threat. We crashed through the thick underbrush, not caring where we were headed, as long as it was away from that cabin, trying to stay on a trail to avoid getting lost. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the wooden fence surrounding the parking lot. A wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw it. The man's truck was parked on the other side of the lot, engine off, lying in wait like a predator ready to pounce. Mac wanted to run to our car, but I held him back. The parking lot was too wide, too exposed for us to make a safe escape. We hid behind a large tree, cloaked in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As night fell, I heard a sound. The truck's door creaked open. The man climbed out, glancing around the forest once more. Mac made a mistake. He stepped on a branch, causing a snap. The man noticed and lingered for a moment, then started walking toward a nearby tree. We covered our mouths, hearts pounding, afraid to breathe or move as he came dangerously close to where we were hiding. Just then, a forest ranger approached the truck. The man seemed startled or afraid of being caught, so he quickly returned to his truck and drove away. As soon as he was gone, we bolted to our car, not stopping until we were inside with the doors locked. We sped out of there as fast as we could. That night, we drove in silence. The danger was behind us, but the fear lingered. As we finally returned to safety, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if we had stayed in that truck any longer. When we got back, we reported the incident to the forest rangers so they could investigate and warn other hikers to be more cautious. The Window Stalker. It all started that day when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice. "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed,
come back here,
demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard it and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle, attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away, but his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. The freak in the morgue. The coldest place in the hospital is likely the morgue. Stainless steel drawers holding the dead stretch out like a cold, metallic labyrinth. The air is thick with the scent of antiseptic. I am a forensic pathologist. Today, I'm on shift, preparing my tools for my work. Tonight, I noticed something strange. Foreign objects have appeared during autopsies before, like a rusted coin or a few plastic beads. This isn't the first time something unusual has shown up during an examination. I stepped into the storage room, searching for some necessary items, but a few tools were missing. My eyes were drawn to a drawer slightly ajar. I pulled it open to find an empty space, feeling like something was missing, but I couldn't immediately identify what. A strange feeling washed over me, and I couldn't quite grasp what was happening. I hurried out, moving quickly down the dark hallway. I saw something move in the shadows. A hunched figure, resembling a man, dressed wildly with disheveled hair, was obsessively examining some medical equipment laid out before him. I couldn't believe my eyes. Horrified, I saw a clump of hair, a severed finger, and other small body parts. He held them as if worshiping and collecting them. I felt nauseous and disgusted by him, but I forced myself to stay because I knew I needed to do something. I hadn't finished my work yet. Suddenly, the man stopped and looked around, sensing something. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I rushed to the office, my hands trembling as I called the police, reporting the break-in and what I had witnessed. The dispatcher on the other end sounded shocked, but assured me that help was on the way. I hung up the phone, but I couldn't get that horrifying image out of my mind. Who was he? And what was he doing? Suddenly, while trying to find a place to hide, he spotted me and chased after me as if he wanted to make me his next victim, the next piece in his collection. I ran as fast as I could, desperately searching for a place to hide. Fortunately, the police arrived just in time, and perhaps he realized that it was no longer just the two of us. He became distracted, giving me a chance to escape. I managed to escape and crouched behind the desk, eyes fixed on the door, counting every second until the police arrived. The police burst in and found the intruder in a frenzy, as if he had lost his mind. He was caught off guard, his crazed eyes wide with panic. The officers quickly subdued him, wrestling him to the ground as he snarled and fought like a cornered animal. They handcuffed the man and began searching the area where he had been, uncovering his gruesome collection of stolen medical tools, body parts, and a disturbing array of personal items taken from the corpses. His twisted obsession and grotesque passion were fully revealed. I stepped out of the room, still trembling, as the police led the intruder away in handcuffs. The man glared at me with pure hatred. The morgue, once a place of routine and order, had become a site of horror, tainted by human depravity. As the first light of dawn broke, I stepped outside, knowing I had done the right thing and acted quickly. The dead had already suffered enough, and it would have been a tragedy if they were not kept intact. I turned back to the morgue, locking the door one last time. The memory of that night would haunt me, but it was over. I had survived the worst. Horror Story Red Bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait!
The man called out, "And now." She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted, "Help me! Help!" As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
"Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?"
I replied,
I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue.
She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. Horror Story Nightwalkers. I used to work at a small hotel on the edge of town. The hotel was quite peaceful, nestled between dense woods and a long, deserted road. After a hurricane swept through the town, business slowed down significantly. I worked the night shift from 6:00 p.m. to 2:00 a.m., often without seeing anyone for hours. The only sound in the empty lobby was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. One night, I was sitting in the break room, sipping warm coffee and watching the security monitors when I heard a deep voice call out from the lobby. I got up and went to the front desk. There was a man standing on the other side of the glass partition. He was tall, with wild hair and a strange, jittery energy about him. He asked for some towels, so I handed them to him through the opening under the glass. He grabbed them with such force that it made me flinch, and then he left without saying another word. Curious, I watched him on the security monitor as he walked down the hallway, rubbing the towels against his face and neck. It was bizarre, but I shrugged it off and returned to the break room. About 10 minutes later, I heard his voice again. This time, he was back at the front desk, banging on the glass. "My key card isn't working," he shouted. I asked for his room number, but he responded strangely, saying something like 2C Pwy, which didn't match our room numbering system. When I told him that, his demeanor changed. He leaned close to the glass, his eyes wide and wild. "I'm going to kill you," he said with a cold smile. I froze as he repeated it, louder each time, until he was nearly screaming. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, shouting at him that the police were on their way. He stared at me with that twisted smile, mocking me as I spoke to the dispatcher. Finally, he left the hotel, disappearing into the night. I was shaken but relieved that he was gone. I decided to stay in the lobby for the rest of my shift. When my relief arrived at 2:00 a.m., I hurried outside, eager to get home. The cold night air bit at my skin as I walked through the empty parking lot. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like someone walking on tiptoes. I turned around, and there he was, hiding behind a car. His eyes followed me from the shadows, and he whispered, "I'm going to kill you." Panic surged through me. I looked around, trying to decide what to do. My only chance was to run to the nearest house with a light on. I sprinted to the door and pounded on it, screaming for help. Just as he grabbed me from behind, the door flew open, and the homeowner shouted, scaring him off. I collapsed in relief as the homeowner called the police. The police arrived, but he had already disappeared. I identified him on the security footage, but they never caught him. To this day, I still wonder if he's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. Horror Story Haunted Tracks. The legend of the haunted tracks had always been a topic of eerie fascination in our small town. The story went that, decades ago, a tragic train accident had occurred on the old, abandoned railway line just outside town. Many lives were lost that fateful night, and it was said that the spirits of the victims still lingered, haunting the area. As a skeptic, I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, but that changed one cold winter night. I was driving back home after visiting a friend when a heavy snowstorm hit, making the roads nearly impassable. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing, hoping to save some time. The wind howled, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the narrow, winding road. The visibility was almost zero, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I approached the old crossing, my car suddenly stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, the biting cold stinging my face and hands. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint, distant whistle. I froze, remembering the tales of the haunted tracks. The whistle grew louder, and I saw a light piercing through the snowstorm, heading straight toward me. Panic set in as I realized it was an old steam train, barreling down the tracks at an alarming speed. I abandoned my car and tried to run, but the snow was too deep, and I stumbled. As the train approached, I could see it more clearly. A rusted, ancient locomotive, its windows shattered, and the metal twisted and scorched. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the train passed right through me, sending a bone-chilling cold through my body. I turned to see it continue down the tracks, disappearing into the storm. Shaking, I returned to my car and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I wasted no time getting back on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached home, I was too shaken to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Mark about the experience. Mark, a local history buff, was intrigued and suggested we investigate the site together. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we headed to the old railway crossing that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear night. The tracks looked abandoned, covered in snow and rusted with age. As we walked along the line, Mark recounted the details of the accident. A collision between two trains due to a signaling error, killing dozens of passengers. Suddenly, we heard it again, the distant whistle. The air grew colder, and a light appeared down the tracks. We watched in disbelief as the same ghostly train emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward us. Mark, braver than I, stepped forward with his camera, snapping pictures. The train passed through us again, leaving us both shivering and breathless. When we reviewed the photos, we were stunned. In each shot, ghostly figures were visible, faces twisted in pain and fear, hands pressed against the windows as if pleading for help. We had captured the spirits of the victims, forever trapped on their final, tragic journey. The haunted tracks were no longer just a legend. They were a grim reminder of the lives lost and the restless souls that still wandered, seeking peace. I never took that shortcut again, and the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a chilling testament to the power of the supernatural. We met a crazy clown in the woods. In the summer of 2016, amid bizarre clown sightings across the USA, I stayed at our friend Milo's house, which bordered a dense forest. After a day of movies and snacks, we felt restless and decided to take a late-night walk. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the forest at 2 a.m., our conversation mingling with the sounds of the night. By 2:45 a.m., we reached a clearing with an old, creaky playground until Milo pointed towards the old restroom building. There, partially illuminated by our flashlights, stood a man in a tattered blood red clown suit. Unlike the playful clowns from childhood, this one was menacing. His face was pale, with smudged makeup and a wide, eerie grin. His hair was a tangled mess of red and black. Paralyzed with fear, we watched as the clown stared at us, his head tilted to one side. Then, he started walking towards us, slow but deliberate. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively backed away, trying to decide whether to flee or confront the figure. Suddenly, the clown broke into a sprint.
Help me!
That was all the motivation we needed. We turned and ran as fast as we could back towards Milo's house, the forest path a blur beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the forest and onto the road in front of Milo's house. We glanced back and saw the clown standing at the forest's edge, partially illuminated by the streetlight. He had stopped running but was still watching us, his sinister grin visible even from a distance. In his hand, he held a big rusty axe. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. We bolted into Milo's house, slamming the door shut behind us. Milo's parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us, alone and terrified. We gathered in the living room, each of us trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. Milo turned on the front door camera, and we watched the screen in tense silence. The clown appeared at the edge of the frame, walking slowly down the street towards the house. He stopped in front of the gate, looking around as if searching for something. My heart sank as he approached the front door, his gaze fixed on the camera. He leaned in close, his face filling the screen, and made a series of grotesque, mocking gestures. He waved the knife slowly before stepping back and disappearing down the street. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. The image of the clown's twisted grin and the knife haunted our thoughts. We didn't tell anyone about the encounter, fearing disbelief or ridicule. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly innocent adventure can turn into a nightmare. We often wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run back to Milo's house, and the unsettling question of who, or what, the clown continues to haunt us.
Horror story of school locker. Sure, here is the translation of your text into English. A few days ago, Anna attended a party. The police showed up, and everyone scattered. Anna took a shortcut, fell into the river, and has been missing since. When they found her, she was no longer alive. She had passed away. The principal asked Kat to clean out Anna's locker. It had been a week since the funeral, and A&A's. Mother still hadn't come to collect her belongings. Kat nodded, feeling both curious and fearful. Anna had been one of the popular girls, always surrounded by friends. The news of her sudden death had shocked everyone. She wasn't like that. I was quite shy and had almost no friends. She approached the locker, its dull gray door a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of its owner. She twisted the combination lock, and with a metallic click, it opened. Inside, the locker was neatly organized. It only took her a few minutes to scoop Anna's belongings into her backpack. There were just a few textbooks, a small makeup pouch, and a neatly folded scarf remaining. As she reached in to gather the items, a strange gust of wind brushed against the back of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. She picked up the scarf, its silk smooth and cool. She remembered that Anna always wore this scarf like a treasured possession. It seemed that she really loved it. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in the confined space, telling her that the scarf was beautiful and would suit her perfectly. Her heart pounded. Perhaps she had imagined it. She continued cleaning the locker, but the unease lingered. As she closed the door, the whisper came again, more insistent this time, telling her,
Wear it always, and everyone will admire you.
How could she refuse? Even as goosebumps rose on her skin, she nodded and tied the scarf around her neck. Although it was silk, it felt heavy, pressing down on her bones. Kat looked up at the mirror and almost screamed. She didn't just look like Anna in that moment. She was Anna. The scarf somehow warped her skin, transforming her face. She pulled with all her strength, but it wouldn't come off. Her elbow struck the mirror, causing it to bleed. Then a voice whispered,
It's okay.
and assured her that everyone would love her. She decided to take a chance and see if it was true. Days passed, and she began to notice changes. People who had never acknowledged her before started to smile and greet her. The popular crowd invited her to sit with them at lunch. Kat enjoyed the attention she was receiving. She attributed the change to her makeover and the confidence boost from wearing Anna's scarf, so she didn't believe it too much. But the whispers started again and wouldn't stop. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Anna's reflection staring back at her, smiling that familiar, haunting smile. It was as if Anna was still there, watching, waiting. Day by day, the whispers grew into screams in her head. Panic set in. She stumbled, knocking over her bedside lamp. As she went to school, she always avoided that locker because she felt a dark presence looming around Anna's locker. Kat's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull the scarf off, but it tightened, choking her. Then a voice echoed in her head, asking what she was doing. The next day, she decided to return the scarf to Anna's locker, hoping to break the curse. When she approached the locker, the hallway was eerily silent. She unlocked it and placed the scarf inside. Before she could close the door, the scarf flew up and wrapped around her neck again. She fell to the floor, the scarf tightening more and more. Her vision darkened, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the locker mirror, her face now twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. A few days later, students whispered about Kat's disappearance. Her locker remained shut, and the smell of decay began to permeate the hallway. The principal and the janitor tried to open it, but the new lock seemed fused shut. Only Kat had the combination. One evening, as the janitor was mopping the empty hallway, he heard a faint whisper.
Wear it, and everyone will admire you.
The janitor glanced around, but saw nothing. He shook his head, thinking it was his imagination. But as he turned to leave, He caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. He saw Kat's face staring back at him, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, smiling that haunting, familiar smile. The janitor gradually turned pale and was so frightened that his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He ran out of there as fast as he could and immediately went to the police station to report what he had just witnessed. At first, he thought it was just an illusion, but when he linked it with Anna's departure and Kat's disappearance, it was really a coincidence, as if there was some kind of curse. Sometime later, the police came and took the cabinet out of the school. The mystery of Kat's disappearance and the scarf remains a mystery that no one wants to talk about. The curse of the top students. The school stood tall and intimidating with its Gothic architecture, old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls. The atmosphere always felt gloomy. The walls were adorned with old portraits of past headmasters and notable students, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed by. The floor creaked with every step. Elena, a studious girl in her late teens, was seated at a desk near the back of the classroom, immersed in a book. The room was empty except for her, and the silence was suffocating. The school had a bookshelf dedicated to the history and legends of the school over the years. It was quite large and sparked her curiosity to learn more. Elena searched through the archives, looking for information about a mysterious curse she had heard rumors about. While reading an old history book about the school's founding, she came across a leather-bound book, aged and ancient. Unexpectedly, a page with a paper bookmark revealed a section about the curse of the good and top students at the school. Years ago, the school had been plagued by a series of unexplained events. The top students began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their academic excellence seemingly attracting a dark force. Shadows moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the hallways. Elena read about how the curse started with a student who made a pact with an unknown entity to achieve academic success. The price was their soul, and the curse had haunted the school ever since. Elena left school to go home. She started to feel scared because she was one of the top students at the school. She hadn't witnessed anything herself, so everything seemed vague to her, caught between reality and fiction. As she descended the stairs, the eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, glowing faintly and eerily in the light. Elena entered the bathroom to splash water on her face, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She looked up into the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her breathing became rapid, and she quickly left. Elena sought refuge in the science lab, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange events. As she flipped through a textbook, the lights flickered and went out. She heard a low growl and saw beakers and test tubes rattling on their own. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending shivers down her spine. Panic. Elena ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She heard whispers of her name, growing louder and more urgent. She stumbled and fell, the whispers now a cacophony of sinister voices. Beware, your turn will come. Desperate, Elena burst into the headmaster's office, hoping to find answers. The office was dark and cluttered with old papers and books. The headmaster's chair slowly turned to reveal a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Elena screamed and backed away, tripping over a stack of books. Elena fled the building, her heart pounding. She looked back at the school, which now seemed even more menacing under the moonlight. As Elena ran across the school grounds, She felt a presence chasing her. She reached the gates and looked back one last time. There was a dark shadow peering out from the window. Safe back in her room, Elena tried to calm herself, but the events of the night kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began writing about the curse, determined to warn others. As she typed, she felt a strange sensation. A shadowy figure lunged towards Elena. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grabbed her arm, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of terrifying visions. Students being dragged into darkness, their faces twisted in silent screams, and the entity that started the curse grinning maliciously. Elena saw the student who made the pact, standing before a dark figure with glowing eyes, signing a blood-soaked contract. Elena snapped back to reality, the shadowy figure gone. She was left shivering, a dark mark on her arm where the figure had grabbed her. The screen faded to black, and the only sound was a whisper. "Good luck. If you don't leave, you will be next." She didn't know if the curse would follow her, but with such a warning, she decided not to stay another minute. The next day, she left and transferred to a different school. Not long after, the school was abandoned due to rumors, and students gradually left.
The elevator of apartment 13. I had just moved into a new apartment building, a towering structure of steel and glass in the heart of the city. The building was modern, with sleek finishes, key card access, and an array of amenities. But what attracted me most was the affordable rent, something almost too good to be true in this part of town. My apartment was on the 13th floor, which didn't bother me despite the superstitions surrounding that number. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was still settling in, getting used to the sounds of the city and the hum of the building. The neighbors were quiet, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways or elevator. However, I began to notice something strange about the elevator itself. Every time I used it, it seemed to take longer to reach my floor, and there was always a strange clicking noise just before the doors opened. One evening, after a long day at work, I stepped into the elevator, ready to unwind in my apartment. The elevator was empty, as usual, and I pressed the button for the 13th floor. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator began its ascent. As I leaned back against the wall, I felt the familiar sensation of the elevator moving, but then, abruptly, it stopped. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen as a makeshift flashlight. The elevator jolted, and the lights came back on, dimmer than before.
Help me!
The floor indicator showed that I was between the 12th and 13th floors. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the elevator began to descend slowly, as if under someone else's control. The air grew thick, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down on me. The clicking noise started again, louder this time, echoing through the small space. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor, and the doors opened. I peered out into the hallway, which was eerily dark, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. My instincts told me to get out, but something held me back. There was a presence in the hallway, something unseen but undeniably there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickly pressed the closed door button, my hands trembling. The doors shut, and the elevator continued its descent. But the clicking noise didn't stop. It was almost rhythmic now, like footsteps above me. I stared at the ceiling, fear gripping me as the noise grew louder and faster. The elevator stopped again, this time on the 8th floor. The doors creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, just out of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. The temperature in the elevator plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I slammed my hand on the buttons, desperate to get the elevator moving again, but it refused to respond. The shadow began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. Just as it reached the threshold of the elevator, the doors snapped shut, and the elevator plunged downward, faster than before. I held onto the railing, my heart pounding in my ears. The clicking noise was now deafening, as if whatever was in the elevator shaft was right above me, following me. The elevator stopped suddenly, the doors opening to the lobby. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and looked back just in time to see the shadowy figure standing in the elevator, its hand outstretched as if reaching for me. The doors closed, and the elevator ascended again, disappearing into the darkness of the shaft. Shaken, I reported the incident to the building management, but they found nothing wrong with the elevator. I moved out the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in that elevator, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the living. To this day, I avoid elevators, especially in old buildings, and I'll never forget the feeling of that cold, oppressive presence in the apartment building of 13. It was a reminder that some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by something far more sinister. Train to hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision. deeper and deeper until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes, his lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. The stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
Someone like her with someone like you?
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine.
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. The school's isolation room. It was 3 years ago that I had a memorable experience in my life. I am a musician and a member of my school's music club. I was often invited to participate in performances at music camps and workshops. That year, I was invited by a school in the suburbs. At the beginning, I felt very happy and excited to be surrounded by friends who shared the same interests and passions as me. As the bus rolled into the town, I noticed the place was quite lively, but that pleasant feeling didn't last long. Within minutes, the bustling noise disappeared. I looked out the window and realized we were entering a dense forest. All I could see were countless trees, and it seemed very quiet. Finally, after a few hours, we arrived. The school appeared before us, and it looked quite mysterious. The students here seemed somewhat unusual. They wore their uniforms neatly and strictly, though the fashion was a bit outdated, like from a decade ago, but their expressions were like they were soulless. They glanced at us with cold eyes whenever we passed by. We had separate rooms, and I went to mine. In my room, there were 3 girls staying together. The room looked rather bare and had little light coming in. Strangely, while we were in the hallway, they kept staring at us in a strange way. That night, after a long day, I returned to my room. I'm not good at sleeping in unfamiliar places, and this place was no exception. I tossed and turned for hours, feeling uneasy and uncomfortable. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard slow, soft footsteps. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Too scared, I pulled the blanket over myself and tried to sleep. The next morning, while we were packing up, I casually asked, "Did anyone else hear footsteps last night?" May, one of my friends, burst out laughing, saying that it was probably just our imagination. But then, Lee suddenly started trembling and asked me,
You heard it too?
We all froze. A strange silence filled the room as we realized that we had all heard the same sound. Throughout the day, I struggled to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to those footsteps. By the evening, my fear had grown. I just wanted to go home. That night, the atmosphere in the room felt even heavier. None of us could relax, let alone sleep. Hours passed, but we remained wide awake. Lee eventually fell asleep. May and I stayed up, whispering to each other to distract ourselves. It was just after 2:30 a.m. when the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, clearer. I broke out in a cold sweat, and goosebumps covered my skin. The footsteps grew closer. Both of us pulled the blankets over our heads, trembling, hoping that whatever it was would leave us alone. Then, I felt it, a light touch on my arm. My breath caught in my throat from the chilling sensation. I trembled, feeling someone standing beside me. I have no idea how long we stayed like that. It was truly a nightmare. The final day at the school seemed to drag on, exhaustion and fear weighing on us. We were drained. As we boarded the bus, the students still stared at us, just like when we first arrived, for no apparent reason. It felt as though they knew something we didn't. On the way home, May fell ill. The bus driver glanced at us through the rearview mirror and said something I will never forget.
I can't believe you actually stayed overnight in that school.
Later, we searched for information about the school and found forums where people were discussing it. It turned out that the room we stayed in was called the isolation room. We also discovered that 2 years before we arrived, 3 students at the school had died there due to the pressures of life, studies, or something else. That's why it was called the isolation room, to keep people away from it. I don't know if anyone else besides the 3 of us has gone through this terrible experience. Did they hear the footsteps, feel the cold breaths on their necks like we did? I'll never know. But what I do know is that those 3 days were the most terrifying of my life. The old classroom was sealed off. It was my senior year of high school when the rumors about room 217 started circulating. Room 217 was an old, unused classroom tucked away at the end of the 3rd floor hallway, sealed off for as long as anyone could remember. The door was always locked, the windows covered in thick layers of dust. Students whispered about it in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted, though no one seemed to know why. One rainy afternoon, after staying late for an after-school project, my curiosity got the best of me. My friends had all gone home, and the school was eerily quiet. As I packed up my things, I realized I had left my notebook in the library. On my way back to get it, I wandered down the 3rd floor hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The scene was so empty and scary. When I reached the end of the hall, there it was, room 217. The door looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the wood cracked and the brass handle tarnished. But to my surprise, as I approached, I heard a faint noise coming from inside, indistinct whispers. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear more clearly. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was whispering behind that door. My pulse quickened as I stood there, unsure whether to leave or investigate. Against my better judgment, I reached for the doorknob, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The lock was completely rusted and no longer worked. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing the dark, abandoned classroom inside. Desks were scattered haphazardly, chairs overturned, as if the room had been left in a hurry. Dust particles floated in the pale light that filtered through the dirty windows, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I stepped inside, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to come from every corner of the room, though I couldn't make out any specific words. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I reached for the nearest desk, half expecting something to leap out at me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was locked in. The whispering grew frantic, almost angry, as if the unseen voices were arguing among themselves. My chest tightened with panic, and I backed away toward the windows, desperate to find a way out, but the windows wouldn't budge, sealed shut by years of grime and rust. Then I saw it. On the far side of the room, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting on the chalkboard, was a message: "Get out." The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. They were louder now, furious, as if urging me to leave. But the door remained locked. My head spun, the pressure building in my ears. I was trapped. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, and fear gripped me like a vice. In a last desperate attempt, I ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, like a chorus of angry voices all speaking at once, filling the room with their fury. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and every hair on my body stood on end.
Just when I thought I would pass out from fear, the door swung open with a violent force, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The whispering stopped instantly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, out of the building, and straight home without stopping. The next day, I told a teacher what had happened, hoping they would check the room. But when we returned to room 217, the door was locked once more, and the classroom looked undisturbed. No one believed my story. For the rest of the year, I avoided the third floor altogether. But even now, years later, I still hear the whispers in my nightmares. Something was in that room, something that wanted me gone, and I'll never forget the terror that filled my heart in the whispering classroom.
Night shift at the morgue. I worked as a security guard at a local hospital in the morgue area. The place often experienced break-ins by a few addicts trying to experiment with some strange chemicals stored in the lab, and eventually it became their final resting place. Everything started like a normal night shift. Hygiene plays a crucial role in the hospital. To keep the place more sanitary, they recently installed automatic sliding doors that open when someone passes by, eliminating the need to touch any door handles. Every night at exactly 3:00 a.m., the door would open for a few seconds and then close again. I believe the door was programmed with some kind of time-based trigger. But when I contacted the door installation company, they told me that was impossible since the door was designed to open only when the sensor was activated or manually operated. So, this continued without explanation for a long time and became a routine for everyone watching the door open and close on the monitor every night. Tonight, I was on shift alone because my colleague was sick, and there wasn't enough time to find a temporary replacement on such short notice. I was no stranger to danger and didn't worry about working alone at night. The security monitors showed only 2 cameras, one facing the control room and another at the far end of the hallway looking toward the morgue entrance. When the clock struck 3:00 a.m., I did what every night guard on duty would do. I started watching the screen. As usual, the door moved, but honestly, I still got chills sometimes from the sudden rush of cold air every time the door opened. Suddenly, the door remained open. I thought it was a screen glitch, but the lights on the door were still flashing. I waited a few minutes, but I soon realized I had to go down the hallway because the morgue door was strictly prohibited from being left open. As I walked down the hallway, the cold air blew against me, and I thought it would be even colder when I reached the morgue. I had hoped that the door might have closed by the time I got there, but just as I saw on the monitor, the door was indeed still open, and the camera was functioning normally. I tried waving my hand in front of the sensor, but it was useless. The door didn't budge. I reluctantly considered my next option, which was to check the sensors from the inside. As I turned around to look down the hallway, the door finally closed. I felt my hair stand on end as a strange quietness settled in a sensation like someone was standing right behind me. Out of curiosity, I went back to the monitor. I decided to rewind the security footage to the moment I approached the door to see if I could spot anything unusual. And what I saw was something I shouldn't have witnessed. There was a girl standing in front of the door behind me. I couldn't clearly see her face because of her long black hair and the white dress she was wearing. She just stood there smiling, staring at me with one eye. To this day, I still can't explain it, as I had just been there and hadn't seen anyone. It wasn't until I checked the other camera that faced the entrance to the control room that I truly shuddered, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. Due to a mysterious power surge, most of the data on the drive was completely corrupted. I stared at the blank screen, my mind reeling. The events of that night played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the room, watching from the shadows. Every night, as I try to sleep, when the clock strikes 3:00 a.m., I can still feel the chill in the air, the weight of invisible eyes on my back, and the quiet whisper of the girl who is there. Take the wrong Uber driver. It was late November, and we had a small party. I stumbled out of the bar into the freezing cold air. I stood on the sidewalk, the world around me spinning slightly, my mind foggy from the alcohol. My friends stayed behind, eager to celebrate a little longer, but I had a flight to catch the next morning. I needed to pack. I needed to sleep, so I booked an Uber to take me home. I opened the app, and luckily, a driver accepted almost instantly. The app showed it would arrive in 4 minutes. Then, a car pulled up. The car's headlights flashed at me. From a distance, I thought I saw someone wave at me from the window. I was tired, and maybe my app was just glitching. The driver must have arrived early, that's all. Without thinking much, I stumbled into the car. Inside, the car smelled faintly of old cigarettes, and the seat creaked beneath me. I glanced at the driver in the front seat. He didn't look back at me, didn't say a word. He didn't even confirm my name. I just wanted to get home. I muttered my address and leaned back in the seat. It was then that I noticed the GPS on his dashboard was turned off. I was startled. Why hadn't he entered my address into his GPS? Everyone uses GPS for Uber, even drivers familiar with the area. I watched him drive, hoping he just knew the route well. The car sped down the street, but something felt off. This wasn't the way to my dorm. I nervously told him.
I think you're going the wrong way. My school is in the opposite direction.
For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded, but he didn't turn the car around. He just kept driving. I started to panic. Where was he taking me? The car stopped in front of a rundown office building. The street was deserted. Why had he stopped here? He didn't say a word. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Slamming the door shut, my mind raced. My hands trembled as I slowly pulled out my phone. My heart sank when I saw the missed calls from my actual Uber driver. I'd gotten into the wrong car. This wasn't my Uber. I was in danger. I needed to get out now. I quickly sent my location to a friend via text. If I called the police, he might hear me. But then I heard a slow, low chuckle. I looked up through the window, and there he was, smirking at me, staring. He circled the car. My hand moved toward the door, pressing down the lock. He hadn't noticed. I frantically moved from door to door, locking each one in a frenzy. The faint noise alerted him. His smile vanished. His eyes narrowed in anger. He stepped closer to the driver's door, his hand reaching for the handle. When it didn't open, he angrily pulled at it, yelling, "Open the door!" I knew I only had a few seconds left. Desperate, not waiting any longer, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, hoping they could get there faster. I didn't get a chance to speak. The sound of glass shattering stopped me, and I screamed as I saw him punch the window with his bare hand, glass flying everywhere. His arm pushed through the broken window. I dropped my phone, desperately trying to get away from him, clutching the door handle on the other side, frantically unlocking it to escape before he could grab me. I ran as fast as I could since he was injured and stuck with his hand in the broken window. I couldn't stop. I stumbled but kept running, my body filled with overwhelming terror. The night was pitch black, with the only light coming from the distant glow of the city. The abandoned lot stretched endlessly, nowhere to hide. But I kept running, praying that somehow I would survive. I spotted a small store up ahead, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the distance. My legs burned, but I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the store. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear. The store clerk stared at me, wide-eyed in surprise. But I was thankful I had escaped him. The police arrived minutes later. 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the office building where the car had been parked. But when they got there, the car and the man were gone. Only shattered, blood-stained glass remained. The police reassured me that they would search for him. It was a hard lesson learned that I must always be more careful when going out alone, especially when I'm not fully alert. Late night passenger. When I was younger, chasing money at all hours of the night seemed necessary. I picked up a side job as an Uber driver. The job wasn't glamorous, but driving around the big city was something I enjoyed. Every day after 5 p.m., I'd grab a quick bite and begin my Uber shifts. Most nights ended around 2 a.m. This story took place on one of those long nights, about 6 months after working 2 jobs simultaneously. There was a hospital downtown with a large parking lot. It became my regular spot to take short naps while waiting for rides. It was quiet, away from the city noise. That night, after hours of driving, I went there to rest. I didn't plan on sleeping long, just a 15-minute nap. When I woke up, I couldn't remember where I was for a few minutes. I glanced at the dashboard, and only 15 minutes had passed. My music playlist was still playing, soft and mellow. I checked my phone, hoping I hadn't missed any ride requests. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. A man was suddenly sitting in the back seat. He was right behind me, just staring. Then he smiled, a creepy, unsettling grin. I turned to face him, and sure enough, he was there. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, and he only wore one shoe. His face was grimy, and he seemed exhausted, like he had been on the streets for a while. Something wasn't right with him. I didn't know how long he had been there, how he got in, or what he wanted. I glanced at his hand, and there it was, an open phone displaying the Uber app. My mind started racing. Maybe he had wandered out of the hospital, saw my car running, and thought it was his ride. I tried to stay calm. "Hey, are you waiting for a ride?" He didn't respond right away. His eyes darted from the roof of the car to the floor, avoiding my gaze. I pointed to his phone, hoping he understood. I asked again, "Do you need a ride?" He nodded. The gesture was slow, cautious, and uneasy. I forced a smile and told him I'd take him where he needed to go. I tried to act normal, to ease the tension in the car. But deep down, something about this man wasn't right. I left the hospital parking lot, following his vague directions to an old, closed-down music venue downtown. Then it hit me. I hadn't accepted a ride request on the Uber app. This guy wasn't my passenger. I glanced at the rear-view mirror again. His phone didn't show any ride request. He wasn't connected to me at all. I spoke, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just realized this ride hasn't been registered. Can you find me on the app quickly?" That's when his entire demeanor changed. He scoffed, looking out the window, then turned to me with a cold expression, saying he wasn't going to pay for the ride. I nervously chuckled, hoping it was a joke, but he remained silent. The atmosphere in the car grew tense. I glanced at him again and noticed a hospital discharge bracelet on his wrist and a dirty backpack beside him. I was trapped in the car with a homeless drifter who must have snuck in while I was asleep. I needed to get him out. I told him I wasn't giving him a free ride across town, and that he was lucky I hadn't called the police. But before I could grab my phone, he lunged and wrapped his hands around my neck. His hands were rough, calloused. I struggled trying to pry his fingers off, but he was too strong. A stench emanated from him. I could barely breathe. Instinct kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the brake. The sudden stop sent him flying forward, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I swerved toward the curb. He was dazed. I shifted the car into park, dialed 911, and honked the horn. He groaned, recovering from the impact, and started coming at me again. But this time, I wasn't powerless. I screamed into the phone, describing everything as fast as I could. Then, as if he realized the game was over, he grabbed his backpack and bolted out of the car, vanishing into the night. A few blocks away, the police caught up to him. I watched as they cuffed him. Later, I found out he had escaped from the hospital after being admitted for an overdose. He wasn't just a drifter, he was dangerous, and I had escaped something terrible. As the night came to a close, the only thought in my mind was, I'll never forget to lock my car doors again. Headless bus passenger. Late at night, the university campus was eerily quiet and shrouded in darkness. Kala hurried toward the campus bus stop after a long evening of studying. The long, empty street was lit by only a few dim streetlights. There was only one bus left at the stop, its headlights cutting through. The cold, misty air. She boarded the bus, her eyes briefly glancing at the driver, a man well into his years, his face lined with deep wrinkles and dark, unreadable eyes. Kala sat in the middle of the bus, trying to relax, but she suddenly sensed something strange. Through the rearview mirror, she realized the driver was staring at her intently. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something on her face. After a few minutes, she began to feel something was wrong. The route they were taking was unfamiliar. Instead of heading toward her dormitory, they were drifting into a desolate area, where thick darkness swallowed everything. She leaned over, peering out the window, looking around in growing confusion. Kala turned to remind the driver about her destination, but he didn't respond. His eyes were no longer on the mirror, but fixed straight ahead. He pressed on the gas, speeding up, ignoring the narrow, winding roads. Kala's fear surged. She raised her voice,
This isn't the way to my dorm.
but the driver didn't hear or didn't care. His face had gone pale, as though he was terrified of something unseen. Suddenly, the bus swayed, and vague shapes began to materialize outside the windows. At first, they were shadows of people standing by the roadside. Then they became clearer faces with empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silent agony. They stood there, watching like bloodthirsty specters. Kala curled up, trembling, too afraid to look at those ghostly figures for long. She felt like screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally slowed down. The familiar sight of the dormitory building appeared ahead, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Without wasting time, she grabbed her backpack and hurried off the bus. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the driver's voice for the first time that night. His voice was low, trembling, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. The driver's words were brief, but they hit Kala hard.
Wait!
His voice was tense. The driver told her that when he looked in the mirror earlier, he didn't see her head, only a headless body sitting where she was. He had been driving in circles, trying to shake off the spirit he believed had latched onto her. He couldn't hear her when she spoke because, in his eyes, she had already disappeared. He then warned Kala,
When you get to your room, take off your clothes and burn them immediately.
Kala stood still, the weight of the driver's words pressing down on her. Staggering, Kala made her way into the dorm building, her mind still spinning. She fumbled with her key at the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, Kala rushed to her roommate's bed, shaking her awake. Her roommate listened, wide-eyed, as Kala explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Kala frantically began taking off her clothes, her movements hurried and desperate. She gathered them into a pile, staring at them as her mind replayed the driver's warning. With trembling hands, Kala picked up the clothes and went to the bathroom. She struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of fabric. The flames quickly consumed the clothes. But had it really ended? She returned to her room, exhausted, lying down on her bed, but unable to shake off the lingering terror. The room was silent. Only the sound of her and her roommate's breathing filled the space. The next morning, sunlight poured in, as if to dispel the previous night's fear, but unease still clung to her. She stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly. Her head, her eyes, and her entire body, but her gaze was far from peaceful. She couldn't erase from her mind the image the driver described the moment when he didn't see her head in the mirror. The darkness from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, as if waiting for a moment of weakness to return. She knew her life would never be the same. The haunting memory of being headless and the spirit the driver had tried to divert would forever follow her, reminding her that terrifying things exist right next to us in the most unexpected moments. The house is haunted. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in a large, beautiful house. But that house wasn't always ours. It used to be an old police station. At first, everything seemed perfect, but there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It all started when I couldn't sleep in one specific. As a baby, I cried endlessly until my parents decided to move me to another room, leaving that bedroom for my brother. Years passed, and by the time I turned 5, the nightmares began. They weren't ordinary nightmares, they were terrifying. There was always someone visiting me whenever I slept. Sometimes it was a woman in a white dress standing at the foot of my bed, other times a man in a police uniform. Their presence made it impossible for me to sleep peacefully, especially that man, every night. He chased me in my dreams without knowing the reason. In my dream, I would run, but no matter how fast I ran, he would always be right behind me. I called for help, but couldn't. Night after night, I wandered through my nightmares, waking up screaming in terror. It all felt disturbingly real. Some nights, he would sit on my bed, his twisted smile inches from my face, staring at me without blinking. All I could do was silently cry and beg for mercy. Not only was I affected, but my parents were exhausted from the sleepless nights. My mother always tried to reassure me, but I could see him standing right behind her, watching and smirking. Of course, my mother couldn't see him. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I could still feel his presence somewhere in the house. It followed me everywhere, like a shadow always lurking behind me. A dark figure standing still, observing. I felt as though I was living in a haunted house. I could feel him behind me as I ran up the stairs, his breath on the back of my neck. I started running up and down the stairs, but I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always right there, just out of reach. When I was a teenager, I finally opened up to my mother, recounting every detail about the terrifying figure that had tormented me for years. Her face turned pale as I spoke. She told me something that made my skin crawl. Our house, once a police station, was haunted by the spirit of an officer who had been anything but friendly in life. When he died, his spirit returned to the building and refused to leave. As it turned out, his office was the very room I couldn't sleep in as a child. That room was now my brother's bedroom. My mother had also seen him and felt his presence, but it didn't stop there. My brother had seen him too, and what he told me sent chills down my spine. Last year, when my brother was 16, the man appeared to him as well, yelling at him to get out of his office. My brother, strangely calm, replied, "No, this is my room now. You're dead. You need to leave." Over time, the man's attitude softened, and they began to coexist, even talking to each other occasionally. I was shocked. My brother had been living with this terrifying presence for years, but had kept it all to himself. I asked him why he had never told anyone. He simply said he knew no one would believe him. Eventually, we moved out when my little sister was born. The new house was free of ghosts, and I was relieved to finally leave that nightmare behind after 8 long years. But what about my brother? For the first 2 years in our new house, the man still visited him. But he was different now, no longer frightening, just visiting, as if he had found some peace. My brother said he no longer sees him and believes the man has finally found rest. Hearing that, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The man had moved on. But to this day, my brother and I can still see ghosts. Yet none has ever frightened me like that man from the police station. The weird neighbor. At the time I am recounting this, it happened 2 weeks ago. I don't like my neighbors at all, so I am not bound by the idea of needing good neighbors. The neighbors living in the same row as me always play loud music, while the neighbors living in the opposite row are the scariest people I have ever met. Next to my house, there is a woman around 60 years old who is not friendly at all. She usually stays inside and looks out of the window in a strange and creepy way. On the other side, there is a young woman with severe mental illness who occasionally stands in a corner of the yard and sometimes stares at me, mumbling. Since I am temporarily staying in this place, I just ignore it and pretend nothing is happening. Sometimes, when I am sitting and looking out the window, the old woman next door is watching the abnormal woman across the way, flailing and screaming as if she is intently watching a horror movie. It makes me feel chilled. It's quite annoying. As usual, I went to bed early to wake up for work. Luckily, nights here are generally quiet. Suddenly, an unusual noise woke me up. Somewhere, there were screams, yelling, and things being thrown from the old woman next door, a painful cry erupted. I got up and went to knock on her door. She answered with a screaming voice.
"What do you want from me? Go away."
I just asked her to keep as quiet as possible so I could sleep. She glared at me with a frown. From somewhere, the mentally ill woman rushed over to where the old woman and I were standing and asked,
"Why did you dare to imitate?"
I was confused and wanted to leave immediately, but the old woman continued to glare at me with a frown. I went back home and went to bed in defeat, but I realized they finally became quiet. I didn't think much of it and silently thanked because I had finally escaped this situation. I was too exhausted. Straight until 3 a.m., I, being sensitive to even the smallest sound, suddenly heard a faint clattering noise downstairs. I stepped out to investigate, but didn't hear anything. So I thought I was just sleepwalking and went back to bed. I woke up again, as if someone was nudging me to warn me. Then I heard laughter or some animal sound. Panicked, I reached for my phone by the bed for light, but when I found it, I didn't dare turn it on to see if there was something there. Suddenly, a shadow appeared at the head of the bed, like the old woman next door or the young girl. I couldn't tell which. Then, I screamed like I had lost my mind. I ran away as if I had seen a ghost. I bolted and slammed the door shut, locking it. I ran for my life. I suddenly woke up, panting, and looked out the window. Everything was silent. Perhaps I was haunted by what I had seen before. Maybe I would have to move sooner before I go insane. A few days later, that mentally disturbed girl was reported by the police for breaking in. I breathed a sigh of relief as if I had just passed a test. She looked at me again, then at that girl. Maybe this place is no longer safe. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine. We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. Two people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun, threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the two people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out, but I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive. Red bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait! Wait!
The man called out. She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted,
"Help me! Help me! Help me!"
As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. "Well, you." His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?
I replied, I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue. She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me.
Scary story in the hospital. Nana. She is a nurse with experience working with elderly patients at a geriatric hospital. Today is her extra shift, so she is severely sleep deprived. She was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward love her very much. Tonight, Nana is attending to some patients, but one of them makes her more uneasy than the others. Her name is Len. Not only that, this is a poorly lit hospital room. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic, mixed with a faint musty odor that sometimes gives her goosebumps and makes her shiver. This is her first night working with Mrs. Len. Len is a middle-aged woman with messy hair and wide, fearful eyes. Every time she enters the room, Len starts talking about the voices she hears and the man in black in the corner of the room. Another woman in the room had requested the curtain to be drawn before her shift started so Len wouldn't be disturbed. The shift starts around 9 p.m., and most patients are asleep by 11 p.m., but not Len. Whenever she calls her in, she speaks with a trembling voice about the voices she hears. The man in black keeps staring from the corner of the room, which frightens her a bit. She has to reassure herself that it's just the medication. She believes that in Len's mind, she is seeing and hearing these things and feels very empathetic. Just imagining those things is very scary. She tries her best to help Len calm down and sleep. Len calmed down and fell asleep after a while. When most of the patients have fallen asleep, time seems to pass very slowly. The corner of the room appears darker, the shadows thicker, and now it has become suffocatingly silent. 1 or 2 hours later, while Nana was in the equipment room to get some supplies, I heard something in the room. The room was quite small and relatively quiet. Strangely, she had closed the door. She immediately turned around but saw nothing and continued to focus on getting the supplies. She tried to focus, but Len's silent warnings echoed in her mind, creating a sense of unease. A moment later, she suddenly felt a cold chill down her neck, as if a hand touched both of her shoulders. Nana looked down at her shoulders and then screamed loudly, but there was nothing there. She looked around and checked the door. There was no one in the room, but she felt a large presence gripping her shoulders. With no other choice, she had to complete her work. She continued loading items onto the cart until it was full. When the supplies were full, the single light bulb above her flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Nana glanced at a moving shadow reflected on the wall in front of her. She turned around and saw a faint human silhouette reflected in the glass window of the storage room door. The figure was not clear, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood completely still, watching her. Her breath caught, and her hands began to tremble. As she slowly approached, she started screaming loudly and collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding as she saw the man in black standing there, smiling eerily through the glass. The scream was loud enough to wake everyone up. The man disappeared from view through the glass door, and a few seconds later, the door opened, and one of her colleagues helped her up. She immediately asked about the man, but there was no one else there besides the two of them. The scream had awakened Mrs. Len, and when she walked in, Mrs. Len was holding her head, repeatedly talking about the voices, the laughter, and the screaming. Nana asked her what the man in black looked like, if he was smiling strangely. But Mrs. Len just focused, frowned, and looked at the corner of the room, terrified. She then said,
"How do you know?"
And Nana began to feel scared, her heart racing, thinking it might be true. Mrs. Len started screaming to be taken out of there and urged to be removed quickly before he arrived. The other nurses came in and tried to help her calm down. That night, due to unstable mental health and overwhelming fear, every creak and groan of the old building startled her. Her nerves were tense and painful, but she vowed to protect her patients from any darkness lurking in the shadows. Determined to find the source of this evil presence, Nana, with a sense of medical duty, returned once more, summoning all her courage as she descended the creaking basement stairs, the air growing colder with each step. She found herself in a forgotten basement room filled with dusty old medical equipment and shelves lined with ancient books. In the center stood an old mirror covered in a thick layer of grime. Nana approached the mirror, feeling a powerful, oppressive energy emanating from it. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the reflection, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Realizing the figure was bound to the mirror, Nana frantically searched the room and found a ritual doll on one of the shelves. An inscription indicated it could be used to banish the spirit. Gathering all her courage, Nana placed the doll down and recited a prayer she had learned as a child, hoping to expel the evil presence. The shadows wavered, and the figure seemed to weaken. But it wasn't enough. The figure screamed in rage as she pressed the cross and the doll against the mirror. The glass shattered with a piercing sound, and the figure disintegrated. The room began to warm, the oppressive feeling dissipating. Everything gradually felt lighter. Everything was strangely quiet and peaceful. A few days later, Len improved and was discharged from the hospital. Nana continued her work with a new purpose, always vigilant for potential encounters with the otherworldly. This was also a testament to the power of courage and the triumph of light over darkness.
The eccentric stranger in the hotel. Kit always remembers that terrifying day. It was the day she and her family went to a small 3-star hotel in the suburbs to celebrate her sister Judy's 16th birthday. Kit's father had arranged everything, and they checked into a room on the 3rd floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and since there were not enough pillows in their room, Kit had to go down to the reception to ask for more. She locked the door and headed toward the elevator. That's when she saw him. At first, she didn't notice the man sitting in the corner of the hallway because it was so dark, just a shadowed figure sitting there. As she got closer, needing to pass him to reach the elevator, she could see him more clearly. His hair was disheveled, his coat was filthy and torn, and he was muttering to himself while holding a handful of small stones, counting them one by one. As Kit walked by, she accidentally locked eyes with his bloodshot gaze, and slowly, he gave her a deranged smile. She quickly averted her eyes and hurried to the elevator. She collected the pillows from the reception and stepped into the stairwell to return to her room. The memory of the encounter sent a shiver down her spine, filling her with anxiety. As the door opened on the 3rd floor, Kit's worst fear was confirmed. He was still sitting there, her face darkened with unease. He remained in the same spot, humming to himself as he toyed with the stones. Kit tried to walk quickly past him, but then she heard footsteps behind her. A sinking feeling hit her he was following her. She didn't dare look back again. The faster Kit walked, the quicker he followed. He began giggling, and the sound of the stones rattled throughout the hallway. She reached her sister Judy's door, but it was locked, and no one was inside. Kit didn't allow herself to stop. She sprinted straight to her parents' room. She pounded on the door frantically, nearly losing consciousness in her panic. She screamed, "Dad, please open the door," in utter desperation. But the man kept approaching. His arms reached out toward Kit as if to grab her. His long, filthy fingers were caked with dirt. Kit screamed again, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the man stopped. His demeanor changed. His head tilted as though he'd heard something strange. His eyes gleamed as he mumbled,
"Dad?"
like the word meant something to him. Then he smiled a slow, eerie smile that made Kit's skin crawl, and he began to back away. He didn't turn around, didn't run, just slowly retreated, while never taking his eyes off her, as if he was waiting, testing something with Kit. Finally, her parents opened the door, having heard Kit's screams. She rushed inside, tears streaming down her face in terror. Her father decided to search the hallway for the man. Strangely, he had vanished, disappearing quickly into the shadows. She couldn't sleep. The next morning, she was still trembling. As they went down for breakfast at the hotel, she was shocked to see 2 police cars parked outside. Her father was speaking with a police officer, his face serious. When he saw Kit, he called her over and asked her to tell the officers what she had seen the night before. She described the man in as much detail as she could. A family from the floor above had reported that their 7-year-old daughter was missing. The little girl had left her room late at night to get something from the vending machine, but never returned. The police checked the security footage, and there he was, the man Kit had seen, carrying the girl over his shoulder as he walked out of the hotel at 4 a.m. The girl appeared to be asleep, but the police believed she had been knocked unconscious. As the days went by, the memories lingered for Kit. She couldn't sleep, constantly imagining his figure sitting in the corner of her room. Even the smallest noise would send her into a panic, leaving her breathless with fear, and she no longer wanted to leave the house. Her parents eventually sought help from a therapist. The therapist explained to her that everything she was experiencing was normal after witnessing something so traumatic. It was a psychological injury, and Kit would need time to heal. As a witness, Kit followed the case closely. In the end, the case was closed without the police ever finding him. He was just a drifter, a predator. Kit wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to escape the memory of that night, but she knew she needed to move on and become stronger. Hide and seek in an abandoned house. Today, I decided to ignore my parents' warnings and meet up with my friends to play hide and seek in the old abandoned house near the woods. I remember everything clearly: the musty air, the creaking floors, and the thrill that washed over me as we sneaked into the dilapidated building. Jack, Rian, Lexi, and I. We loved adventure and the adrenaline rush, but nothing could compare to the mystery of that house. The house was surrounded by barbed wire, with the gate tightly locked, but we found a small hole in the wall, hidden behind overgrown grass, just big enough for us to crawl through one by one. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. We decided to play hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I closed my eyes and started counting. The others scattered throughout the house, laughing, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms.
98, 99, 100.
I opened my eyes and immediately went searching for my friends. It didn't take long to find Lexi and Rian, but Jack was different. He was always better at hiding. I searched every nook and cranny, every room, until I caught a glimpse of a shadow darting by.
Got you, Jack.
I mumbled and ran after him. But something was strange. The shadow seemed faster, slipping around corners as if leading me on. My excitement turned into doubt and fear. No matter how close I thought I was, the shadow always evaded me, disappearing just as I was about to catch up. Not long after, Jack finally came out of the master bedroom, scratching his head. He apologized, saying he had hidden in the closet and fallen asleep. But my heart skipped a beat. Who had I been chasing? I gasped and told Jack and the others what had happened. They laughed, teasing me for trying to scare them. Determined to prove it, I convinced them to play again. We played again. I resumed searching, but soon that uneasy feeling returned. The house was too quiet, too still. My friends were nowhere to be found, and the more I searched, the more convinced I became that something terrible had happened. Then I saw it again. A hand reached out from behind a wall, waving at me from a distance. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of shoes on the ground, just like Lexi's. I called out, but she didn't answer. The hand waved at me again from afar. I moved closer, but as I approached, the hand disappeared. I chased after it, only to find another arm waving from the top of the stairs. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find anyone. Then I saw a face that looked like Rian's in the window. He stood still, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I knew something was wrong. I pressed my face against the window to get a closer look, and it was a child, about our age, but with a wrinkled, aged face, eerie and twisted. His clothes were stained with red patches, and I froze when I saw him holding something, a long, rusted, sharp metal rod. Before I could move, he spoke in a chilling voice.
"Oh, you found me. Now it's my turn."
He grinned widely, then began counting.
1, 2, 3.
Panic surged through me. I didn't take the steps one by one. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. His laughter echoed behind me. I remembered the secret closet Jack had hidden in earlier. In desperation, I dove inside, pulling the door shut and holding my breath as I listened. I didn't dare make a sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would leave. I must have passed out from lack of oxygen. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. It turned out my parents and the police had been searching for us all night, and my friends had managed to escape to alert them. Later, we found out that he was the escaped mental patient the police had been searching for. Because he was as short as a child, he had crawled through the hole in the back wall and turned the abandoned house into his temporary hideout. His favorite thing to do was play hide and seek with children, and then harm them in various ways. The most terrifying part, the police still haven't caught him. Whispers behind the door. It's been 9 years since that happened, but I still remember it clearly. In the middle of the city, I rented a small apartment in an old, damp-smelling building. With my job as a waiter, it was all I could afford, just enough to get by. Not long after, something strange began to happen. It started with small noises, almost unnoticeable at first. A faint voice, muttering in the middle of the night. I remember waking up that first night, the sound barely audible, like someone whispering on the other side of the wall. The walls weren't well insulated, so I could hear it. At first, I thought it was a dream. The voice was too distant to make out clearly. But soon, the words became clearer, sharper.
"Go die."
The words echoed in the dark, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, every hair on my neck standing on end. Who would say such a thing? My eyes darted toward the door. I got out of bed, quietly stepping toward the peephole. Slowly, I saw a thin man, shirtless, his face twisted into a wide, terrifying smile. His hand scratched slowly at the door with a single finger, the gentle sound of it sending chills through me. He just stood there, scratching the door and whispering. From that day on, the man became a frequent, unwelcome visitor. Every 2 or 3 nights, he would return, scratching at my door, mumbling, and sometimes singing in a shrill, childlike voice. The sound was terrifying, like a nightmarish lullaby. Every time I looked through the peephole, there he was, whispering threats. I thought about confronting him, flinging the door open, and demanding he stop. But I couldn't see his hands, they were out of view, and I feared he might be holding something dangerous. The mumbling stopped. Everything was silent. I leaned forward, cautiously pressing my ear against the door. Then a loud knock startled me, sending me falling backward. He said,
"I know you're there. Be careful."
But in the daytime, it was as if nothing had happened between us. I'd run into him in the hallway, and he would smile politely, nod, and walk away. I even asked him once why he kept coming to my door at night. He seemed surprised, then confused, denying any knowledge of what I was talking about. One night, I was about to sleep, but I had to grab something from the living room. The mumbling started again, but this time, It felt much closer. I crept toward the bedroom door, checking to make sure it was locked. Thank God it was. But the doorknob turned slowly, rattling as if he was testing it. Then silence for a long while. I didn't know how he had gotten in. I was terrified, but after the silence lasted long enough, I decided to go out and check. I stepped outside. From the corner near the door, I saw my thin neighbor banging his head against the wall, singing something I couldn't understand. I was truly frightened. I tried to talk to him, but he only turned and threatened me. I stumbled back, startled, but he wasn't hurt. He just kept grinning and eventually walked out of the apartment by himself. I decided I had had enough and finally called the police. They took him to a psychiatric ward. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had escaped from a mental hospital 2 months earlier. Apparently, he had a violent history. In fact, he had been admitted after attacking a mailman with a shovel and had snuck out undetected. Now I live in another city, far from that building, far from the memories of those nights. But sometimes, I still can't sleep well, unable to shake the feeling that he might come back. Strangers in the online classroom. Online classes have now become a part of our academic lives, and no matter how much I try to adapt, I still prefer in-person learning because it helps me focus better. I live alone in a small rented apartment, away from my family. That day, my last class ended at 9 p.m. I pretended to pay attention, but in reality, I was scrolling through my phone under the desk, sipping on an energy drink to stay awake. The lecture went on, and I barely listened. The class was about to end, and as soon as my teacher logged out, a few friends and I decided to stick around and chat. We were joking around, unwinding after a long day when suddenly, something strange happened. The familiar sound of someone joining the conversation echoed through my headphones. A new name appeared, Tim OO. None of us knew who this was, but we thought it was just one of our friends playing a prank on us. At first, it was funny. We laughed, waiting for them to reveal their identity. The camera on this new person's feed turned on, but the screen was pitch black. We couldn't see anything, and all we could hear was heavy, raspy breathing through the microphone. One of my friends, Thomas, decided to break the tension by mocking the situation. He joked,
"Oh no, I'm so scared."
Our laughter was forced, half-hearted at best. Then the stranger spoke. The voice didn't sound entirely human. It was deep, distorted, as if they were using a voice modulator. My body went cold, and my skin tingled with fear. The laughter stopped. No one said a word. Thomas asked, his voice trembling,
"Who are you?"
I wanted to believe it was still a joke, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The screen shifted. Something moved forward. Now I could see more, just enough to make out a face. But the face was wrong. It was distorted, twisted. One eye was higher than the other, and the mouth curved into a bizarre grin. The low-resolution camera made it even creepier, as if the features were shifting, morphing before my eyes. I wanted to believe it was a mask, but it didn't look like one. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. Thomas wasn't laughing anymore. No one was. We were frozen, staring at this grotesque figure, unable to look away. Then the stranger spoke again, this time calling Thomas by name. I got goosebumps when he said,
"Because you've been so mean to me, I'll punish you first."
Thomas turned pale. His nickname in the chat was just Student 17. There was no way this person could know his real name. My mind was spinning. Who was this person? How did they know Thomas's name? I could hear him gasping through the mic, his voice shaking as he stammered,
"How do you know my name?"
The screen flickered again, and the image disappeared. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting, trying to make out the faint image. I messaged Thomas in a private chat, asking if he was okay, but fear gnawed at me. What if this wasn't just a joke? What if that person knew where Thomas lived? What if they knew where I lived? Wet, dragging footsteps echoed through the speakers, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, the figure leaned in, its grotesque face filling the screen. The camera was now so close that I could see every horrifying detail: cracked and peeling skin, hollow, white, soulless eyes. We screamed in panic. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I shouted for Thomas to log out and escape. Without hesitation, we shut the laptop. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I double-checked, quickly locking all the windows and doors. I grabbed my phone to check on Thomas, to make sure he was okay. But as I did, I felt something in my room. I knew it was irrational, just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was real. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that deformed, decaying face staring at me from the darkness. Even though the call had ended, the fear lingered. The next morning, I texted Thomas, and a wave of relief washed over me when he finally replied. He was safe. Nothing had happened to him overnight, but none of us could shake the lingering terror. We told our teacher about what had happened, but no one could explain it. And just like my classmates, no one confessed to playing this prank. No one could tell us who Tim OO was or how he had entered our chat. Days passed, but the fear lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. Every time I logged into class, I checked the participants list. I still couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Maybe he was out there, watching us.